There are two problems with clumping grasses. The first is that there's so much detail, there are so many of these spiky prongs coming out of these things that we become overwhelmed. The second problem is what we know about them. These are very common and we understand, we know how they're formed, these long thin straps or spikes, almost like wires coming out of a central core that splay outwards. And because we understand this is how they're formed, that affects what we want to draw. We want to draw what we know is there. We think that we know what we're looking at. We think that we know what we're drawing. And so we combine these two. Rather than try and tackle the complexity we see, we're overwhelmed by that and we start to just draw lines based on what we know these look like. And we end up with a fairly cartoon-like effect, something like what you're looking at now. Not real looking, more of a symbol for clumps of grass. So let me show you another way to think that gives us another way to draw, not just clumping grasses, but so many subjects of overwhelming detail. This is a great example of how, by drawing the effect of the detail, not what we see, we can end up with a far more realistic drawing. This is also a great subject for understanding that when we draw, it's so important that we do have an understanding of a drawing process. And for many people, the only understanding that they have, and often it's not thought out, it's just assumed, is that we're copying what we see in the photo. And well, we can see the problem. There is so much here that we see. How can we possibly try and copy it? And when we do, we get that oversimplified drawing that we've just looked at. Rather, I need to try and capture what I'm seeing. One way of understanding drawing that I use is we're translating a photo language into a drawing language. And I only have the language, the words and letters and grammar that I can get with a black pen. So you can see what I'm doing at the moment. I'm actually focusing on the three-dimensional form of this. I'm not thinking particularly of individual blades of grass. I'm looking at the overall shape, which is still very complex and very textured, and not an easy overall shape to even picture, let alone to start to draw. But I realize that what I do see, I see from two main areas. I see from individual fronds, or not fronds, they're blades of grass coming out at me. So I want to capture some of those. But I particularly understand the roundness of this and the ball-shaped nature and the fact that at ground level they're coming out over the ground. I understand that three-dimensionality through the shadows. And so the shadows are going to be really, really important, particularly the darker shadows, and you can see that's what I'm doing. Now, I have drawn some individual fronds, and I've got to be careful to try and make them random. If I'm not careful, they'll all be equally spaced, and that won't look natural at the end. But I'm also trying to get the size and the angles and the variation. The ones that are going upwards tend not to bend very much. The ones that are lower down bend more. So, having observed, if you like, the biology of the plant, I try and copy that as well. But while I put some, if you like, representative fronds out, I'm not trying to draw fronds in the end. I'm trying to capture the visual effect. So, as I said, some of that effect is captured by having some highlighted fronds. And at the very end of this, you will see me emphasize just a very few fronds on the closest clump, the one I'm drawing now, and pay attention to how much of a difference that makes at that point. So at this point, I'm not trying to create the finished effects because I have a whole bunch of clumps to do and I have to manage that differently. But it's particularly the shadowed areas, but the shadowed areas aren't all the same degree of shadow. Across that there's a line at the bottom where we get closer to ground level where the shadow is darker, and then there's a band where we still have that I drew earlier with those two lines, where we still have shadow, or shade actually, but it's a much lighter value. It's a much lighter grey scale than lower down. So I want to create this range of values as well, but I also want to leave a lot of paper showing to represent where we have the light effects. And so we're going to be basically understanding this form from three ways. From some individual, if you like, token fronds, blades of grass, highlight blades of grass, from the darkness that will indicate the three-dimensional, if you like, wraparound shape of all this, and from the silhouette edges, because we're not actually really going to be able to draw the fronds that are in the light, the blades of grass that are at the top that are catching the light so clearly and look so spiky. We're going to capture that effect by drawing the darkness behind, the negative space in. So these are the challenges and these are the things we're having to do. And you can see that I've started doing all these three things here because I'm not trying to draw a copy of these clumps of grass. I'm trying to visually, with the marks I can make with a pen, and you can see at this point it's been a 0.2 millimeter uni pen. And please hit that like button if you're finding this helpful. And now I've forgotten what I was saying, but we're trying to capture the effect, not draw individual bits, or at least no more individual details than we need to capture the effect. Because when I look at this, if I look very carefully at this photo, at any one clump of grass, I can see almost every blade of grass in it. But when I look at it as a whole, I actually see more a clump of grass than I see all of the individual blades. And so again, that's the effect I want to capture. If I can capture that effect, I won't be drawing all the blades of grass, and yet this is why it will look more real than if I try to copy every blade of grass. Because in life, we don't see every blade of grass. It's just that we know they're there. And we get that visual cue from the... And look, this is the principle of drawing the effect of detail for any subject of overwhelming detail. Obviously, the hair on someone's head would work with this approach. But leaves on a tree, certainly, bricks on a wall, particularly if we're far away, gravel on the road, leaf litter and other stuff on the road. All of this can be so well captured. But in effect, everything we draw, we're really trying to draw the effect of how it looks in life, even if it's a relatively simple shape that it's perhaps tempting to draw an outline copy in our drawing. We want to capture the effect of light and of weathering of edges and so forth. So if we look back at this second clumping grass I've been trying to draw, this one comes behind the first one. So now I have the challenge of getting a sense of that one's in front, one's behind. And look, this is, I think, one of the trickiest parts of this, because I want the one in front to still end up feeling like it's in front, clearly in front. And that's one of the things I'm taking into account when I do those final last few lines that I think make such a difference that I mentioned earlier. So remember that when you see me do them, they're also about separation from this front clump and the one behind. So now there's another clump behind. There's actually a clump behind the first one to the right a bit, which I did start to block in simply so that I could get that dark value to highlight the top of the front clump when I was talking about that. Now I've switched to a 0.05 millimeter pen now, because I'm not sure whether I'm going to draw it with this or a heavier pen. But if I start with a heavier pen with the 0.1, well, if it's not what I want, I can't do anything about it. Whereas if I feel that this looks a bit too light, then I can swap for the 0.1. So I'm really just trying to work out what am I doing where and get a sense of each clump. You might notice that for, I think, most of these clumps, I do a bit of a dotted arc where I think the not the highest points, but the main sort of bulk of the blades of grass come up to. So I find that very helpful because it helps me keep whatever symmetry I want. It means that I don't find out when I've sort of half finished that on one side of a big clump the blades of grass are twice the length and curl a lot more than on the other side. By establishing sort of a roughly symmetrical arc with dots, I can ensure that when I start to focus on individual parts, I don't lose scale of the entire thing, which is always a challenge and a frustration when we draw, particularly if the effects have worked well, if just the overall shape has ended up being bodgy. So you can see now I've applied the same principles here that I have for the first one, but with a bit of a lighter feel. I haven't gone as dark or as heavily with the values, the darkness for the shadows. And I also haven't highlighted as many individual blades of grass either. But this is the second most prominent, it's closest and visually obvious clump. So I still want this one to be a little more obvious than what we're going to draw now behind these. But at this point now, because there's some more clumps behind that second one I've drawn, we see those mostly through the shadow that's underneath the tree that's behind them all. So now I'm roughing in that tree, and now I'm definitely and quite deliberately using the 0.5mm pen, because notice that even though I'm doing these hatch lines very close together, they still create a lighter feel than that hatching I've done down the front, or the hatching I've done in the center, even though the lines really are no closer together with the 0.2mm pen. So it lets me get the effect of lots of hatch lines close together that feels like it's creating a dark value, and yet it's a lighter dark value, and it feels lighter, it feels further away because the marks I've made it with are smaller. It's not just the actual blackness or lightness, but it's also the nature of the marks that we use it with. And this has been a really important discovery for me, because as if you've watched many of my videos, you know that I'm always really focused on depth of plane, of trying to create the sense that this is closer and this is further away. And that's on a two-dimensional sheet of paper. We have no depth. So I can only create the effect of depth because I can't create the reality of depth on the paper. And I found this a really important way to establish dark, greatly hatched areas further back that still feel further back when we look at the overall drawing. Because that's the other thing always to bear in mind throughout a drawing, is it's not the one part I'm doing, but it's how this part looks next to the part next to it, next to the part behind it, next to the part that's down in the front. So I need to be juggling all of these things at the same time. So I'm moving across the back now, and there is a bit of a glimpse of some tree trunks looking through in the center, and then there are some more trees. But again, I'm doing this to really get that silhouette edge. That's my focus, the top of the furthest clump there, and the way the light catches it. I'm trying to define that area. So now you see I've done some hatching lines in a very different direction for the trunk of the tree, so that we can hopefully recognize it as a tree trunk. And it just doesn't get lost in the marks. There's a lot of marks that are perilously close to each other in form and direction and length and so forth. So any possibility of putting some marks on the paper that are really going to stand out as something quite different is a great opportunity to grab. So now I'm thinking just of the overall scene. I don't want to put the detail that we see in the photo in this bottom corner, but I do want to put a little bit of ink just to visually pull it out so it feels overall a little more balanced, because I really want the focus to be on the clump. And so now I'm doing a little more work, just switching my pen, because that I think was a no, look, I don't know what it was, but I've got a 0.2 now. And I'm doing, again, something that visually is very different in the photo, and that means I can draw it with very different marks, with stronger, heavier, more deliberately, more slowly drawn. And that's an important thing to realize. Oh, by the way, you're watching this at slightly less than double speed. This took me 25 minutes in real time to draw. So it's probably a good thing to use the cog icon to in the YouTube settings there to slow this down to half down just for a few minutes, so that you can see how fast my actual drawing speed is. Because I find with a subject such as this, a fairly fast almost flicking motion when we draw. Now I'm doing those strengthening bits. A fast, fairly flicking motion when we draw is so valuable to get the right feel of the marks. These are light, delicate blades of grass. We need to have light, delicate lines, and we don't get them if we draw carefully and slowly and ponderously. You know, we need to have a movement in our hand, in our arm with the pen that helps the ink leave the pen and onto the paper in the most effective way for the visual impact, for what visually we want to produce as we can. So that's really important. And just working out now the boundaries. But what do you think of those strengthening marks I put on that front clump of grass? Look, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Check out my Drawing the Effective Detail playlist if you'd like to see this principle of drawing applied to some of those other areas that I mentioned earlier. And of course, you can find this photo on my post page if you want to have a go drawing it yourself. But whatever you draw and however you draw it, whatever understanding you have when you draw it, make sure you have fun. And however it looks, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.